All right, so the United States empire obviously has a long and extensive track record meddling in Central and South America. We topple democracies and install dictators. We overthrow governments and do coups. We support and fund far-right death squads. We do all of these things basically in this overarching imperial goal of the United States to install governments all around the world that give preferential treatment to U.S. capitalist interests and our economic hegemonic interests. And so as part of this ongoing thing, one of the more recent examples of the U.S. empire acting in this way was in Bolivia. In 2019, there was a coup by far-right fascist movement led by this woman named Janine Áñez, and they were able to successfully build momentum and take power from the left-wing government led by this guy named Evo Morales, who's absolutely 100% based as fuck. And they were able to successfully garner this momentum to do the coup attempt because the United States and our allies and our institutions, like the Organization of American States, put out a report that basically falsely claimed that there was widespread voter fraud in the election in Bolivia, and that therefore the election was illegitimate, and this gave them momentum. There were lots of protests in the country at the time, and this allowed for this far-right government to take a foothold. So again, just another example of the United States inserting ourselves in whatever way that we can in these affairs of these South American governments in order to install fascist governments instead of left-wing governments because we want to exploit their resources. Lithium is one of the biggest resources in Bolivia. That's something that we have a vested interest in taking a firm grip on. And that's not something that Evo Morales, the guy who was leading the left-wing government, was willing to do. He wanted to socialize their lithium stores to benefit the Bolivian people instead of U.S. corporations. Obviously, the United States didn't like that, and so they supported a far-right fascist coup instead. And so here's some new information with some fantastic reporting from Ken Klippenstein and Ryan Grimm, where they're getting into some of the details as to how the United States uses our institutions in order to apply pressure on even American citizens who are just trying to do honest research to expose some of the falsehoods that are put out, again, by institutions like the Organization of American States. So DOJ threatened MIT researchers with subpoena in collaboration with Bolivian coup regime. Emails to the analysis show the Trump administration's complicity with a Bolivian criminal investigation. So they say, a Justice Department trial attorney repeatedly contacted Massachusetts MIT researchers asking, eventually under threat of subpoena, about research they had conducted on the 2019 Bolivian presidential election, according to emails obtained by The Intercept. Sent between October 2020 and January 2021, the emails point to the existence of a Justice Department inquiry and add new evidence to support Bolivian allegations the United States was implicated in the 2019 coup. The emails reveal the Justice Department's involvement in the Bolivian coup regime's criminal investigation into alleged voter fraud, which has not previously been reported. The inquiry targeted a pair of respected MIT researchers about their work for the Center for Economic and Policy Research, in which they broadly refuted suspicions that Bolivia's Socialist Party had rigged the election. So because of researchers like this, that's how we knew that the Organization of American States and the United States, therefore the Trump administration, were lying about widespread voter fraud. Not something that should be too unexpected that Donald Trump and his administration would be willing to lie about widespread voter fraud, right? But they continue on here. So giving a little bit of context, as the votes were counted on election night, Morales was ahead as expected. The question was whether or not he would win enough to avoid a runoff, which in Bolivia is triggered when a candidate wins by a margin of fewer than 10 points. In an unofficial tally, Morales led Mesa by 7.9 points, giving the opposition hope for a second round. But when the official count was released, Morales had won by 10.6 points, obviously then meaning that there would not need to be a runoff. Then, without evidence, the opposition immediately leveled fraud charges. It was backed up by the next day by the OAS, the powerful hemispheric cooperation organization based in Washington, D.C. Quote, the OAS mission expresses its deep concern and surprise at the drastic and hard-to-explain change in the trend of preliminary results revealed after the closing of the polls, read the OAS's incendiary statement. Protesters then took to the streets, the military called for Morales to step down, and the opposition installed a new leader, Janine Áñez, after 3 weeks of unrest. Far to Mesa's right, Áñez assumed office and swiftly attempted to eliminate the sense of enfranchisement for indigenous people that Morales' government had brought. So the OAS, right, comes up with this justification and says, we think there was widespread election fraud in this election. And the way that they justified that was saying, well, some of the exit polls before the final tally said that you were up by only 7 point something percentage, and then the end result said that you were up by 10.6 and would have avoided a runoff. Let me explain to you how bullshit this is, and it's very simple, okay? The reason why there was such a drastic jump from him leading by only 7.9%, I think it was, up to 10.6%, the reason there was that discrepancy, I'll explain it using a US analogy. This would be like if we were counting the Joe Biden versus Donald Trump election results, and we left California and New York and a couple other heavy Democratic states as the last states to count. Then, obviously, if you were counting the results and you counted those states last, Democratic strongholds, then Joe Biden, even if he was leading by a small margin above Trump without those states, obviously his gap in how much he was beating Trump by would then jump by a significant portion because those regions that you were counting votes from happen to be heavily Democratic. That's exactly what happened in this same circumstance. The reason why his number of support, his number of votes, the percentage went and did that significant jump was because the remaining votes left to be counted were heavily indigenous populated areas, were rural areas where there are miners and farmers who support the socialist government, who support the socialist leader Evo Morales. That's why there was such a jump. And the Organization of American States took that and ran with it as if it was evidence of widespread voter fraud. I mean, this is Trumpian levels of lying here that we have going on about widespread voter fraud. But again, not surprising coming from the Trump administration. So they continue on here that the New York Times, obviously, this is just to give you a perspective on how the US media was following in line and being the stenographers for the Trump administration, okay? The New York Times did not exercise any scrutiny in their reporting of this OAS report here. After the Organization of American States declared on Sunday that there was clear manipulation of the voting in October, the paper editorialized, Mr. Morales was left with no choice but to resign, bitterly tweeting from an unknown location that the world and patriotic Bolivians will repudiate this coup. So Evo Morales obviously ended up being 100% correct about that. Patriotic Bolivians did repudiate this coup, and there were massive protests as a backlash to the far-right fascist insurrection, and they did eventually regain and take power after another election years afterwards, where Evo Morales' party was able to take back power. So he was repudiated 100%. The New York Times obviously giving their embarrassing stenographer approach to how they report on these types of things. But in fact, it would be statisticians who ended up repudiating the coup. Researchers at MIT, commissioned by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, took a closer look at the data and evidence behind the allegations and concluded what many other independent observers had already found. The fraud claims were bogus, according to a statistical analysis conducted by Jack R. Williams and John Curiel of MIT's Election Data and Science Lab. So because of these people and because of these researchers, that's how we knew that the OAS was lying. So how does the US government respond? The prestigious release was a major blow to the coup regime, leading to references in many of the same major media outlets that had peddled the coup government's election fraud narrative. The new insights snapped the coup government's international credibility, which was further degraded as it repeatedly delayed a new election, with La Paz shut down by protesters. This time, the crowds were on the side of the Mas party. The regime was finally forced to hold an election, and then they retook power. So because of the research like this, we were able to get the Bolivian government justice, in a sense. But 3 days before the vote, the researchers received the first of the Justice Department's requests. Trial attorney Angela George identified herself as an attorney at the Justice Department's official Office of International Affairs, or OIA, and said she had received a formal request from Paraguay for assistance in an ongoing criminal investigation. Courier told her that she had the wrong researcher and she had not worked on any Paraguayan election study, and told her that Bolivia was the one that she had met. George never provided details about the nature of the criminal investigation, the existence of which has not been previously reported. Attempts to reach the coup government's Minister of Justice, Alvaro Coimbra, were unsuccessful as he faces prison, obviously relating to the coup attempt that he engaged in. So basically, what they're saying here, and this is the main point here at the end, the Justice Department inquiry frightened election researchers in the academic community and may have had a chilling effect on subsequent research. So The United States government and our institutional arm of the OAS spreads false information, which is then peddled by a lot of these mainstream outlets, alleging that there was widespread voter fraud in an election that there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud. This claim is then repudiated by MIT researchers who are doing great work, and they put out a report that shows, no, you're actually bullshitting people and there wasn't widespread voter fraud. And then in response to that, the United States government, via the Department of Justice, the DOJ, steps in to intimidate those researchers, to have a chilling effect on future research. I mean, this just shows you how far the United States government is willing to go in these types of situations. Again, this is just part of the ongoing imperial regime that we've had in the United States for decades, for centuries now. This is what we do. We meddle in the affairs of Central and South America. We deny it. We make up bullshit allegations in order to topple democracies. And then when it comes to the back end of it, we're willing to intimidate and go after our own citizens for just doing honest research and analysis, exposing how the government is lying.